In a video going viral, Trevor Noah, who recently hosted the Grammys, argues for the reintroduction of racial segregation. When these people tell you who they are, believe them. What's absolutely fascinating about this is, as Trevor Noah was hosting The Daily Show, the media was attacking anyone who argued that, say, Finland was for Finns. That is to say, there was this big hubbub about white nationalism in Europe with generation identity, the alt-right, and in the United States. They said Trump was a racist, white supremacist, blah, 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 despite the fact that Trump and Tucker Carlson and most of these people are just regular old nationalists. We end up now with Trevor Noah now being, my friends, alt-right. I'm going to say it. Trevor Noah goes full alt-right. Now, what does alt-right mean? It meant racial identitarian nationalist. That is, the alt-right, while predominantly at the time in the late 2000s was about white American identitarian nationalism, there was still like a European component. But the European component was a little bit different because they called themselves indigenous rights activists, because white people are indigenous to these European countries. In the United States, the argument was that white settlers had created America or whatever. Now, you were considered racist if you believed these things, but it wasn't just about the agenda and the policies. It was about how a lot of these activists would say, take a look at Sweden, take a look at Denmark, take a look at Norway. They would say, take a look at Japan. It's not so much that they were racist, so they'd claim. They'd say that the issue was homogeneity. That when a nation was of those people, things were better. It's funny because of that idea, Trevor Noah has gone full alt-right. But don't take my word for it. Let me play the clip for you now. You hear it, and let's talk about it.
I found myself wondering, and this applies to America, and then maybe it'll go to other places in a different way because Finland ties in.
America.
Do you think that integration was the right move? And now I'm separating two things, because I know in America people are like, well, of course, there was racism and there was segregation. And I go, yeah, no. I'm separating them. Let's separate someone being oppressed and someone not being able to get a job and someone not being able to get a bank loan. Let's take all of those, the negative things away, because I'll put myself out personally and say, I think whether we're talking about gifted kids who are anomalous, let's say, to the norm, whether we are talking about and I mean anything that does not fit into a category. I think part of the reason Finland is able to do it is because, have you been to Finland?
It's very homogeneous.
I've been to Finland. You know who's in Finland? Finnish people. That's it.
Yo, Trevor Noah was born in South Africa, and I want to be very careful here because in South Africa they have the legal distinctions. They have white people, black people, and colored people. Those are the legal distinctions at the time. I don't know if they still use those. I believe they do. Black person meant, obviously, you're black. Colored meant you were mixed race. Trevor Noah has written a book. What is it? He's got this book what is this? Born a Crime, Stories from a South African Childhood. He shares his earnest, wholehearted experiences growing up in South Africa, a series of conflicts on race, blah, blah, blah. But let's continue, sir. Continue.
And because they're all Finnish, there's an idea of no, we all head in the same direction. We all know what our actions mean. And that's a really powerful thing I've learned in communicating with other people. When I'm in a room with anyone where we start to tie together multiple things. So if I'm in a room with black people, already there's an implicit trust because we know what certain actions, words, and vibes mean.
Bro, dude just said Finland works because Finnish people know what they want. And they can just identify each other. Then he goes on to say that when he's in a room with black people, there's an implicit trust. Yo, that's wild. I guess I live in a very weird world away from all of these people. And I know that there's in-group, out-group bias, but I just want to stress for everybody. I know you all know I'm from the south side of Chicago, but I just need to mention this because when we'd go to a party, there'd be it's the south side, bro. There's Hispanics, there's black people, there's white people, and there's some Asians and some Eastern European migrants. But there was never a circumstance where I sat down in a room of only white people and was like, oh boy, I feel good now. That literally never happened. There was never an instance where I sat down in a room of all black people and I was like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. Never happened. Maybe it happened to him. I don't know. Maybe it's just because I grew up in a racially diverse area. Don't get me wrong, Chicago's very racially segregated. But, like, we didn't care. Yo, there's gangbangers of all races. The cops treated us all equally bad. This is wild.
And then you're in a room with another African. Already. This person. Now, even if you shout at me, I know what your shout means. The same way an Italian knows what an Italian shout means.
What?
Yeah.
Right? I know I'm prefacing it with a lot because it's a loaded question.
Yes.
But
Okay, let me just break that down for you. Shouting at someone. Trevor Noah just said if a black person shouts, he knows what he's saying the same way an Italian. Is that real? Oh, man, because I don't live in that reality. You know, I've never lived in this reality where, like, I'd see a person, like, I don't walk up, see a Korean guy, and he goes, ah, and I'm like, I totally get that. I don't have the ability to translate for white people and Asian people between each other simply because I have both. That literally makes no sense. There is no guttural primeval grunting that you can inherently understand based on race. Sorry, dude.
I would love to know if you think integration was the right solution, maybe.
Wow.
On the other side of, what America, of civil rights.
Yeah. No, I don't. And I don't think it's actually that controversial when if you understand that segregation and integration weren't the only options. Like within those two options, it may seem like integration is the more progressive. Like, of course, we don't want segregation. But again, when you're being integrated into institutions, into a culture that's a supremacist culture, that's a culture that feeds off of hierarchy, that feeds off of insecurity, anxiety, why are we being integrated into that? And
so I would just like to point out, this is not surprising to anybody who's tracked the ideologies of these leftist identitarians. It's why we have long said they are identitarian. That means government predicated upon the identity of individuals. Now, it typically refers to your race. In the United States, we are American nationalist, not literally everybody. The left doesn't seem to be. But what does that mean? It means you believe in your country. You believe the country should protect the interests of its citizens. That is the default. These people live in this crackpot world. Now, it's fascinating to see them advocating beyond where we already knew they were, going into straight up racial nationalist ideas. I would like to point out, and I mean this with all due respect to Trevor Noah and this woman, and although we don't share, actually, we share some race. Trevor Noah is mixed race. This woman appears also to be mixed race. Black people in the United States tend to be they're mixed due to the histories of the United States and the density of population. There were people who were brought over from Africa on the slave trade, and then there were white people who had kids with them. Thomas Jefferson, notably, historically, had a lot of kids. We end up with many of what people consider themselves to, many people who consider themselves to be black actually do have white heritage. There was a famous story where there was some politician, and it turned out that she had an ancestor who was a slave owner. Conservatives mocked her, and they were like, haha, look, you did your ancestry, and it turns out your own was a slave owner. Haha, you're owned. And I'm like, guys, that's not an own. The left, that's entirely within their ideology. Like, going to a woman who is, to a degree, like, who is socially, identifiably black, and it turns out that there's a slave owner in her lineage, implies her family was abused mercilessly by that slave. That's like, bro, that's not an own. That's like slavery was bad. Like, the slaves were being raped. My point here is, Trevor, I know you are mixed race. I, too, am a mixed race person. How in any reality could this guy now be arguing for segregation? He would not exist. He was born a crime. That's what he said in his book. My grandparents got together at a time of racial segregation, and it was illegal. Loving v. Virginia, the Supreme Court case in 1967, it was illegal for people of different races to cohabitate. That was the norm. Trevor, you would not exist. That's the point of your book. If we go back to racial segregation the way you describe, it's fascinating to me, and I understand a lot of the arguments made. Trevor Noah is not just black, but for the American people, because of the history of the slave trade, And once again, this Princeton professor, who I presume to be, at least to some degree, she has white ancestry. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. I understand that, like, I've heard the arguments, and I get it. These are people who were brought here by force, whatever the circumstances is. I know some people say the kingdoms of Africa sold them off. They were criminals and things like that. It doesn't matter. People were brought here against their will, and then a culture was built up around this after the end of slavery. And that's why they say they identify themselves as black, as opposed to, they say there's no white culture because each different white nation is distinct. Like you wouldn't claim that Irish culture is the same as German culture. So it's not that it's white, it's that it's, German or Irish. The reason why in the United States they say they have a black culture is because after the end of the slave trade and the Civil War, the people who were brought here from the Atlantic slave trade or who were descendants of those people didn't know what nation they came from, what their traditions were. So it was literally just the black American experience. My point ultimately is this, bro. The end of segregation was extremely important. And I know what he's saying. It's not about oppression. He's saying, should we have banks for black people by black people, banks for white people by white people? That's what we want. He's saying the problem with segregation in the past was that they basically said you couldn't have a bank account, you couldn't go to the school. No. He's saying he wants the races to be separate. That's a bad idea. Bro, you wouldn't exist. Ultimately, I find fascinating is that these people do have some white heritage, but do not identify with it in the least bit. That I get for Americans, but not for a South African whose white ancestors presumably defied apartheid and segregation to have a child. I could be wrong about that. I mean, what is it? Born a crime implies he came from a white family and a black family heritage. He was considered illegal and had to live hidden from the government and society itself. Trevor would grow into the shadows without knowing his identity or who or what groups he belonged to. Did he not have white family members that he related to and understood? He's saying in this interview, it's just absolutely nuts that he's like, a black person could shout and he knows what they mean. Bro, don't you have white family? That's crazy to me. Now, I don't come from a direct Korean lineage. My mom is half, so I'm 20% Korean, 5% Japanese, if you know what that means. And it was my grandmother who was Korean. So there's limited cultural understanding. Certainly we had some Korean food and some of it, but it's derivative. You know what I mean? For me, there's some stuff like, I go to, on my mom's side, my uncle would make kimchi and things like that because he married a Korean woman. And there was some component of that I understood. There was no circumstance in which someone could grunt and I would understand them, but, I digress. It's just the American experience was that we are all people of different backgrounds, but we learn to get along. That's what it was supposed to be. This guy, where the left is going, it's a place I can't go. And I don't think any of us want to. We want to be America first. And that means Asian, Latino, black, white, or otherwise. As Tucker Carlson said, the interests of black Americans are the interests of Americans. When they tried claiming he was a racist, he was like, what? Or he said, like, the interests of black Americans are the same as the interests of white Americans. Like, you're an American. Like, you live here. His concern is not that white people are being replaced. It's that Americans are of any racial background. And what irks me is a lot about the left and the arguments they make when they say, like, this country was built by black people and things like that. I say this country was built by everybody who came and was here and contributed to it. The nation was built largely from white governmental and moral structures, but of course, through labor and slavery, and then through the Civil War and the sacrifice of many people who were, don't get me wrong, the North was still deeply racist. We all built this nation to varying degrees. It doesn't belong to any group. It belongs to Americans. Our history is our history together, for better or for worse. Some people have bad history. Some people have better history. Some people are the descendants of Confederate slave owners who fought to maintain slavery, and they did. And some people are descendants of Union soldiers who fought to end it. And some people are descendants of both. This country we inherit is built upon all of these conflicts together, and it's the interest of Americans. It is wild, but not wholly unpredictable. Shout out to our friends on the left. We get it. You want racial segregation. You always did, and now they're just stepping out into the light. I'll leave it there, my friends. We got more segments coming up. Stick around, smash that like button, share the show with everyone you know, and we will see you all in the next segment.